What if everything you learned about God had a color that the world tried to erase? What if, behind the images you have seen since childhood, those white figures, clear eyes, and European traits had a hidden, purposely ignored, omitted truth, buried under centuries of cultural and religious indoctrination? And if God had always been black and we were simply programmed to deny it, as if this idea were impossible, heretical, too uncomfortable to be accepted? Today, in this video, you will be confronted with a reality that avoids a truth that challenges everything you imagine to know about the divine, spirituality, about identity and power. This truth has been distorted for centuries, but today we will bring it to light. Imagine for a moment how many times you have seen representations of God, Jesus, angels, biblical characters, all white. Now think, how many times have you seen these figures as black? How many times have you seen a God with dark skin? The answer, for most, is none or almost none. And this is not by chance. There is a subtle but extremely effective program that shaped the spirituality of billions of people around the world. A program that separated the sacred of African ancestry, which clutched the divine and silenced the voices that shouted for visibility. In this video, we will expose the origins of this manipulation, show historical, biblical, and cultural evidence that point to a black spirituality that has always existed, but has been systematically suppressed. Have you ever wondered why the image of a black God bothers you so much? Why is this idea rejected, ridiculed, or simply ignored? There is a much deeper reason than you think, and it is directly linked to control, power, spiritual and psychological domination of integer peoples. Showing God how white is not just an artistic choice, it is a political, ideological, and religious project. And recognizing this can completely transform the way you see yourself, how you connect with the sacred, and how you understand your spiritual origin. In this video, let's raise questions that never asked you. Let's expose biblical passages that many ignore. Let's talk about Jesus' true appearance, the ancestral representations of God in African cultures, how colonization destroyed the black divine images and imposed others in their place. Let's show the hidden tests, the forgotten evidence, and the deep implications that this truth carries. And no, this is not about replacing a white God with a black man only with symbolic justice. It is about restoring a spiritual connection that has been broken. It is about recognizing that we were programmed to move away from our own image by seeking the sacred. You will find out why the system has preferred to show you a European God, even though you know that the origins of Christianity, the Bible, and the faith are rooted in the Middle East and Africa. It will understand how this narrative influenced not only religion, but also self-esteem, cultural identity, and the way black peoples find themselves before the divine. You will realize that this manipulation was not accidental. She had a clear goal: to erase the black spiritual protagonism of sacred history. What if the true image of God has always been before us, but were we conditioned to reject it? What if divine blackness is precisely what is lacking to restore our faith, our dignity, and our spiritual ancestry? Keep me, because what comes next can change forever how you see God and yourself. If so far some of this content has made you reflect, disconcerted you, or aroused something that was dormant inside you, so you don't keep it just for you, I want to know, what do you think about all this? The image of God you received still makes sense after what we started to reveal here? Tell me in the comments. Your opinion is a fundamental part of this conversation. This channel is not a monologue. It is a collective awakening space. And your comment can help other people also open their eyes. If this content has made sense to you, leave your like right now. It shows YouTube that this theme needs to reach more people. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because what we are starting here goes far beyond this video. The next chapters of this spiritual investigation promise to go even deeper. Your presence here is no coincidence. You were called to see and to understand. And together, let's keep unraveling the truth. Now you started seeing the cracks in this standardized image of God that was given to us. It's time to go deeper, with courage and eyes wide open. Because understanding how the figure of a black God has been systematically erased from history is not just a theological curiosity. It is a spare key, ritual, cultural, and even psychological, that can release an entire generation from the mental prison in which it was placed without even realizing it. For centuries, they taught us to imagine the sacred with European traits, and that was not a coincidence. It was a project, a sophisticated silent project that acted through art, education, religion, and culture to move us away from our own image by seeking the divine. Have you noticed how, even in places where the population is mostly black, the visual representation of God, Jesus, angels, saints, and prophets remains white? This is not an aesthetic detail or a random choice. This is programming, and a powerful programming, because it operates in the invisible. He is in the subconscious of those who pray, who sings, who preaches, who teaches, and who learns. The invisibility of a black God was cultivated to ensure that a whole spiritualized population continued to feel inferior, separated, disconnected from their own sacred heritage. God's cultural representation has always been a power tool. The empires knew this. The church knew that. The colonizers knew that. Because when you shape God's face to your image, you automatically position yourself as the chosen, the divine, the superior. And when you impose this image on other peoples, especially the colonized peoples, you plant in their hearts the seed of spiritual distancing. And with that, it generates dependence, generates submission. It generates shame of its own origin. Therefore, the project to embrace God was not an innocent mistake. It was a political construction, and above all, strategic. During the colonization processes, Christianity was used as a control instrument, but to work, it needed to come with a convincing visual package. A package that would make the colonized forget their ancestral spirituality and accept the new faith as the only legitimate. And what a better image for that than a European god? A deity that, with its golden hair and blue eyes, gave the impression of purity, authority, and holiness, and at the same time reinforced the inferiority of black, brown, and indigenous bodies that were never reflected in the sacred. The goal was clear: to erase the black deity from the spiritual memory of humanity. And for many, this plan has worked to this day. But there is a deeper truth, one that many avoid confronting. The color of God, yes. Not because God itself has a color limited to our human vision, but because the way we represent God directly shapes the way we represent ourselves. If you have never seen a God with your face, your skin tone, with your features, how can you feel truly close to Him? How can you believe it was made in its image and likeness if this image has always been presented as radically different from yours? That hurts. This silences. That alienates. And this spiritual alienation is one of the greatest wounds that colonization has left, and many still carry unknowingly. This is why this video is not just a provocation. It is a search for healing, for truth, for reconnection. Because the black God is not a recent invention, nor a fashion of identity affirmation. It is present in the roots of history, the less read pages of the Bible, in the ancestral African cultures, in the records that were muffled, hidden, or even destroyed. But no matter how much they tried to erase, this presence still pulsates, still echoes, still awakens. And perhaps it is exactly this awakening that the system feared so much. Behind the invisibility of a black God is the fear of the awakening of a people. Because a people who recognize themselves in the divine is an impossible people to dominate. What if black spirituality has been discredited for so long? Is it precisely the missing piece in the great puzzle of world faith? If God has always had a face that looks like yours, then perhaps your story does not start with slavery. It starts with creation. You may not just be a descendant of kings and queens. You may be straight descendant from the sacred. Therefore, every image we see matters. Each painting, each sculpture, each church-stained glass, each movie, each illustrated Bible, everything communicates. Everything builds a narrative that says who deserves to be on the altar and who should kneel, who is the bearer of light and who is the shadow. And as long as we continue to accept these images without question, we will remain stuck within the frame that was painted to limit us. But today we are starting to tear this frame, challenging the brushes that chose the wrong colors, asking, why did you hide this possibility of us? Who decided that God could not be black? Who profitable with this exclusion? And what changes within you, imagining that yes, maybe the creator of everything looks more like yours than they have always shown you? Maybe you feel discomfort at listen to this, and it's okay. The discomfort is the first step to liberation, because true faith is not afraid of questions. She welcomes them. And that's why today you are here, because something inside you want more. More than ready answers, more than recycled images, more than a God shaped by empires. You want the true face of faith, and this face may have been silenced, but it will never be erased. Now tell me, with all sincerity, have you ever stopped to think about it? Does this idea that the image of God that was taught to us has been manufactured to serve a system of spiritual domination? Have you ever been disconnected from your own spirituality for not being represented in the images of the sacred? Comment here below. Tell me if it teased you, made you think, or even bothered you. Writes like this: "This image made me reflect," or "I've never seen God with my color," because every comment of yours can help other people start that same process of awakening. And if you are here, it is because you have been called to see what few are willing to see. But perhaps the most important question that hangs now is, and the Bible, this sacred book that shaped the spiritual thinking of billions of people, what does it say about God's appearance? Is there any indication, any clue left there, purposely or not, that points to something very different from what was taught in the pulpits, catechesis, Sunday schools, and artistic representations? The answer, although uncomfortable for many, is yes. Yes, the Bible brings symbolic, poetic, and even direct descriptions that can and should be interpreted with disprogrammed eyes, with a mind free from the colonial filters that over the centuries have smashed and whitening the divine. Let's be honest, for a long time the Bible has been read under the European look. And not only read, it was also translated, interpreted, and rehearsed under that same look. And as we know, who controls the interpretation controls the narrative. What few realize is that by translating the Bible into several languages, many original expressions were softened, others were adapted, and several lost their strength and cultural context. This does not mean that the sacred text lost its spiritual value, but that its meaning may have been shaped to serve a power structure. And this structure, as we have seen, had as its central objective to remove any trace of divinity that would refer to Africa, melanin, black ancestry. But when we come back to the original text, carefully, attention and open spirit, we begin to see the cracks on this wall of dogmas. See, for example, the description of the Son of Man in Revelation 1:14-15. The text says, "His head and hair were white as wool, like snow, and his eyes as a caul of fire, and his feet similar to polished bronze, as if refined in a furnace." Now, think to me, feet like polished bronze, refined in a furnace? What skin tone approaches this? What kind of appearance is being designed here, even in symbolic language? It is a portrait that completely moves away from the westernized white representations that for so long dominated the Christian imagination. The word used for bronze there in the original Greek is chalcolibanon, a rare term and difficult to translate, but refers to a dark, burnt metal with a strong, hot, intense tone. Under no circumstances can this image be read as something pale or clear. Still, for centuries, this description was ignored or softened, treated as only symbolic. Symbolic of what, exactly? Why the need to empty the image? Why not accept that the Bible can present a God, or a Christ, a strong, dark-looking, linked to the earth, the furnace, the fire, to the origin? The same goes for Daniel's prophetic vision in Daniel 7:9. He writes, "I kept looking at a few thrown, and an elder of days was settled. His clothes were white like snow, and the hair on his head like pure wool, hair like wool." Isn't it amazing how this detail was repeated in different views? And why is this important? Because hair like wool does not refer to a smooth, silky type, nor to thin and drained strands. The wool is thick, curled, dense. Hair have always been identified with dark-skinned peoples, especially Africans and their descendants. However, how many times did you see Jesus, or God, being represented with curly hair, or even with dark skin tone? And how many times have you seen the opposite? This question by itself should already light a warning. We are experiencing an extremely difficult era in which the prophecies are being scored, but many still do not realize what is happening in the world. This is why I made my digital book available, To Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first comment set. This book will help you discover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Access the first comment set to get your copy, because very few remain and will soon be withdrawn. Don't waste time. Click now and make sure your digital copy We are not talking about irrelevant details. We are talking about a pattern that has been systematically built to reinforce a particular spiritual aesthetics and erase another. The aesthetics of the white divine was placed on all altars, paintings, showcases, and pages of illustrated Bibles. Meanwhile, which, whether attempted to show a black deity, was a bound of blasphemy, idolatry, paganism, or, at best, exaggerated revisionism. But why so much resistance? Why so much fear of accepting that perhaps the Creator was, and still, more like the marginalized peoples than the conquerors? This is where the importance of contextualized reading comes in with decolonized eyes. It is not about forcing interpretations, but of redeeming what was hidden. The Bible, when dealing without the glasses of Eurocentrism, reveals a cultural and spiritual richness that points to deep African roots, both in characters and scenarios and metaphors. There are the Ethiopians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the peoples of Cush, all with great relevance in the biblical narrative, and all invariably linked to Africa and the Middle East. And yet, the predominant representation remains white. Why? The answer lies in historical manipulation. And this manipulation did not happen only in the pulpits or in religious schools. It also happened in the translations. Many original terms that pointed to color, ethnicity, or appearance were softened or even removed. The Hebrew word kadar, for example, which means dark or black, appears in poetic contexts, as in Songs 1:5. I am brunette but beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of curtains, such as Solomon's curtains. The original text did not say brunette, said black. But how many translations do you soften this? How many are afraid of the word black when referring to something beautiful and divine? Why does the black divine bother so much? Is it because it threatens an order? Why does it return to the black people the spiritual centrality that was denied to them? Why does it break the visual hierarchy built with so much effort? Maybe that's why so many still resist. Because accepting a black God requires more than changing the image. It requires changing the mind, the heart, the whole structure of faith. And that scares. This revolutionizes. And don't forget to get your digital book, Reveal the Apocalypse. It is very important that you buy it quickly before the copies run out. But perhaps it is exactly this revolution we are in need. Because a faith that hides its origin is incomplete. A spirituality that does not recognize all faces of the divine is a fractured spirituality. And if the Bible, yes, the Bible itself already brought these signs, these images, these references, then it is more than time to revisit it, to reread it, to renter it with your eyes free, not to distort the word, but to rescue what was hidden. And now I want to hear you. Have you ever read these passages with this look? Have you ever wondered about the appearance of Jesus, or about the original terms used in biblical texts? Does this change the way you see the sacred? Tell me here in the comments. He writes, the Bible speaks, but not everyone wants to hear. Or, I will never read Revelation the same way. Choose one of these phrases or creates yours, but shares. Because this is the kind of conversation that needs to echo. And your voice is part of this awakening. If so far we begin to dig up the hidden layers that have covered the face of the sacred, now we need to put our finger in one of the deepest and most symbolic wounds of human spiritual history, the image of Jesus. Because it is impossible to speak of the black deity without confronting the face that has become, over the centuries, the maximum symbol of the Christian faith. And here the question can no longer be avoided. Was Jesus black? And more than that, was the way it was portrayed throughout history was purposely transformed to serve a structure of global domination? Most people grew up seeing Jesus as a white man, light-skinned, straight hair, light eyes or honey, with delicately European strokes. This image is in the stained glass of churches, illustrated Bibles, Hollywood movies, tea, shirt prints, and even prayer applications. It was spread as absolute truth, as if it were a photograph authorized by the sky. But let's stop a moment. Let's breathe and use something that many are afraid to apply to faith: historical logic. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, lived in Nazareth, in the territory of Galilee, and circulated through Judea, regions that today belong to the present Middle East. This already gives us clear geographical clues. The people who inhabited that region in biblical times were formed by Semitic Jews, of Afro, Toas Anal, with very distinct traits from the Nordic peoples of Europe. We are not talking about cold and light-skinned regions. We are talking about the desert, the strong sun, mixed people with African and Arab's roots. To deny this is to deny geography, history, anthropology, and biblical consistency itself. Archaeological studies and ancient cultural records reinforce the idea that Jesus' appearance was closer to a dark-skinned man with a burnt-of sun with thick hair, perhaps curly, thick beard, robust traits. There is no evidence that he was white, none. No verse, no ancient artifact, no painting of the early centuries of Christianity describes it in this way. On the contrary, the first Christian representations, hidden in the catacombs of Rome and the Coptist churches of Egypt, show a dark Jesus, sometimes with almost black skin, intense eyes, without any European trait. So why has this image changed? Why was a Middle East man gradually transformed into a blue-eyed European blonde? The answer, once again, is in power, in the control of the narrative, in symbolic supremacy. The Church, by expanding through the Roman Empire and then medieval Europe, understood that the way Jesus was represented was not just aesthetic, it was strategic. To maintain religious authority in the hands of the European elite, it was necessary that the Savior of humanity would also look like this elite, and so the standardization of the image of Jesus began, a symbolic clanking that would influence centuries of art, education, and doctrine. But this process was not neutral. He had deep consequences in the way non-European peoples came to see each other. Imagine a black child growing, being taught that the Son of God looks like everything she is not. Imagine the psychological, emotional, and spiritual impact of praying to a figure that seems distant, unreachable, that does not share your pain, your reality, your color. This generates a distance, generates shame, generates submission disguised as devotion. Faith is no longer liberating and becomes an invisible imprisonment. This clutch of Jesus was not just an artistic issue, it was a project of spiritual engineering. It was imposed on all colonized territories as part of the evangelization package. In countries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, missionaries arrived with the cross in one hand and the image of the white Jesus in the other. It was like saying, "This is your new God, and he doesn't look like you." The message was clear. To be saved, it was necessary to abandon your own identity, reject your roots, your history, your color, your ancestry. This strategy has been so successful that until today, in the 21st century, thousands of churches continue to show this European Jesus without ever questioning its origin. Many preachers do not even consider that the appearance of Jesus may be different from what they have learned. And when someone raises this possibility, the discomfort is immediate. Why? Because if Jesus is not white, the whole hierarchy built around this image begins to crumble. If the Savior looks like the oppressed, then the oppressors lose their symbolic throne. And this is unthinkable for those who have become used to using religion as a tool of domination. But there is something even deeper here. As they clinked Jesus, they also clinked his message. They softened their radicality, their denunciation against the powerful, their identification with the marginalized. A black, poor, the East revolutionary Jesus, who faced empires and sat with the excluded, would be much more difficult to domesticate. Therefore, it was necessary to turn it into a docile European symbol, adjusted to the elite values. And with that, they lost, or hid, the transformative power of the gospel. Today, however, this mask is falling. The voices get up, the eyes open. The questions arise tightly. What if the Jesus we know is just a manipulated version? What if the true, historical, real Jesus is closer to the color of the earth, the blood of the people, the skin that burns in the desert sun? And if we accept this as truth, what changes within us? It changes everything. It changes the way we pray. It changes the way we see each other. It changes the relationship between faith and identity. It changes the way we read the Bible, how we understand the kingdom of God, how we put ourselves before the world. This is not about painting Jesus in black just for aesthetic reasons. It is about spiritual justice. It is about rescuing a truth buried in centuries of religious propaganda. It is about returning the image of the Savior to the people who was taught to be excluded from salvation for so long. And if Jesus has always had Afro-Asia traces, if he was always closer to the marginalized than the masters, then he has never been the Jesus of the empire. He has always been the Jesus of the people, the Jesus of the hill, the favela, the desert, the senzala, the quilombo, the forgotten communities. Therefore, raising this discussion is not heresy. It is hope. It is liberation. It is reconciliation with our spiritual ancestry. It is looking in the mirror and finally seeing that God can have our face, and that does not diminish the divine. On the contrary, it approaches, humanizes, cure. And it is this cure that is being offered here, now, before you, without imposition, without fear, only with the courage of those who want to go back to the origins, to discover the truth that has been hidden. If this reflection touched you, tell me in the comments. I want to see the true face of Jesus, or enough to worship an image that does not represent me. You can use one of these phrases or write with your own words. The important thing is to participate, because it is in sharing the voices that the truth is strengthened. And perhaps when speaking, you help other people to see too. And it is precisely when we dive deeper into this image of the image, or rather, in the manipulation of the image, that we begin to reach the true scope of God. Only how Jesus was portrayed in churches. It is an intentional, systematic, and highly effective project that used the arts, and then the modern media, as instruments of spiritual programming and mental colonization. Your image, you are not just creating an artistic representation. You are occupying the spiritual imagination of an entire people. Think with me. The absolute majority of the images we have of God, Jesus, angels, apostles, and biblical prophets follows the same visual pattern. White, light skin, straight hair, blue eyes or light brown, clean clothes, serene posture. This visual model is repeated in churches, museums, textbooks, movies, cartoons, sculptures, paintings, religious icons, plays, TV commercials, calendars, and even decorative objects in houses. And it is repeated not by chance, but because those who control art always knew of the power it exerts on the collective unconscious. Art not only communicates, it doctrine. When a people continually see the image of the divine reflected in a body that does not look like yours, he believes, albeit unconsciously, that he is outside the narrative of the sacred. And this generates a kind of removal that is much deeper than the geographical distance. It is a symbolic, existential, emotional clearance. A spiritual abyss is formed between faith and identity, between the temple and the mirror. Because deep down what images say without words is, God looks like them, not you. And this over time undermines people's spiritual self-esteem. It creates a type of hidden idolatry, where white color is associated with divine, good, purity, truth, while other colors become secondary, impure, unworthy, worldly. This is not conspiracy theory. It is a historical and cultural fact. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the artists began to represent God and Jesus with the features of the emperors. Gradually, the figure of Galilee Jewish carpenter was replaced by a Messiah with a Roman face, European body, light eyes, and increasingly aristocratic features. It was not a coincidence. It was a process that intensified with the European Renaissance, when artists such as Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci immortalized this European image of the sacred. The very God of the Sistine Chapel, that old man who extends his finger to Adam, is a purely Western construction, a Eurocentric projection of divinity. Nothing in the Bible sustains that image. Nothing. But she was eternalized, repeated, and celebrated as if it were a real portrait of the Creator. And this white religious aesthetics was used as a tool of conquest during the periods of colonization. When missionaries arrived in Africa, the Americas, the Caribbean, and the East, they brought with the Bible a complete symbolic package: white images, crucifixes with European Jesus, blonde saints, Scandinavian angels. This illustrated gospel was one of the most effective weapons of colonization, because he not only told the colonized what to think, he showed, repeatedly and emotionally impactful, who was worthy of worship and who was not. And so the process of spiritual submission was completed. The repetition is one of the keys of indoctrination. When you see the same image several times, in different contexts, it becomes true in your mind. You stop questioning, accepts as if it were reality. And that's exactly what happened to the image of God. Today, a Black, Indigenous, or Asian child growing in a traditional church will probably see only images of white people representing the sacred. And by internalizing this, She begins to believe that there is something in her that is not worthy of being on that altar. This is the kind of violence that leaves no visible marks, but heals in the heart. And it becomes even more dangerous when the community itself reproduces this image naturally. How many black churches in black majority countries still have paintings with white Jesus on the walls? How many pastors avoid touching this subject, fearful of causing divus or messing with the sacred? Is there anything sacred than the truth? Is questioning an image forged not actually a deeper act of faith than simply repeating what has always been taught? Modern media further expanded this abyss. Famous Bible movies, TV series, children's cartoon, musical clips, all follow the same aesthetics. The holy characters are white. And when a black actor interprets Jesus or some prophet, it becomes news, a controversial cause. It is seen as innovative, when, in fact, it should be the closest to historical reality. See how the narrative was so well built that what is false seems normal, and what is true seems strange. This is mental colonization. It is a silent prison, and many still live in it without even realizing it. But now we are tearing these curtains. We are returning the visual identity of the sacred to its places of origin, because it is not about reinventing God. It is a matter of recognizing how much have distorted him to maintain intact structures of domination. God's image was used as a racial supremacy tool, and it's time to dismantle this scam. This does not mean that God is exclusively black or any literal color, but that he cannot continue to be represented only from a perspective, and on top of that, a false, exclusionary, and manipulative perspective. And have you noticed how these images have been implanted in your mind from an early age? Have you ever wondered why you have never seen black representations of God, Jesus, or angels in the churches of your childhood? Have you ever been feeling wrong, even if no one talked about it? He comments down here, "The image of God has been manipulated," or "I want to see God beyond colonization," or say with your own words what it has aroused in you. Your voice here matters, and it may be the trigger for someone else to begin to see clearly what you have always been in front of your eyes. And now you begin to see how the images have silently shaped the way we perceive God. We need to get into even deeper and more sensitive terrain. The way theology, religious doctrine, what should be released, was used to imprison. Because it was not just the art that collaborated with this project of spiritual supremacy. Institutionalized theology, often interpreted and taught by white men with colonial interests, was shaped to validate the idea that the black people were inferior and that their existence should be somehow under control. And yes, I know how hard this truth can be to face, especially for those who grew up believing that faith was a neutral, sacred territory, immune to the corruption of power. But history shows us that it was not so. Religion was one of the main tools of domination during the darkest periods of human history, especially in slavery. And this is not a theory. This is a documented historical fact. The Bible was used as a weapon, not metaphorically, but literally. Biblical quotes were selected, distorted, and delivered to slaves as a moral and spiritual justification to keep human beings in captivity. Texts that talk about obedience, submission, and servitude were taken from their context and transformed into control manuals. Meanwhile, passages of liberation, equality, and justice were ignored or hidden. For centuries, European theologians wrote and preached based on the idea that the African peoples were descendants of Cam, son of Noah, and that because of the alleged Cam's curse, blacks were destined to serve the whites. This totally wrong and forced interpretation was accepted as truth in seminars, churches, and religious institutions for a long time. She created a theological ballast that supported not only slavery, but also the institutionalized racism that extended for centuries after the formal abolition of slavery in several countries. Do you notice the severity of this? Faith itself, what should unite us with the divine, has been transformed into a mechanism of oppression. And the most cruel is that this was done in the name of God. How many times religious leaders of the time publicly declare that slavery was the will of God? How many times have they used verses such as "Servants, obey your masters," Ephesians 6:5, to justify violence and dehumanization? They taught that blacks should accept slavery as part of their spiritual destiny. They said it was better to obey their masters and win the sky than to fight for freedom and lose salvation. This is not faith. This is predicated indoctrination of salvation. But it was not just words. They were practical. Masses were celebrated in the mansions as the enslaved were picked up on the trunk outside. In many countries, baptisms were only allowed if the enslaved to use eternal loyalty to your Lord. And in many places, the simple attempt to pray with his own ancestral spirituality was punished with whip, jail, or death. The colonizers' faith did not admit competition. Either you accepted the white European God, portrayed with blue eyes and foreign language, or was considered heretic, rebellious, or demonic. This kind of theological imposition did not destroy only bodies, destroyed souls, broke millennial ties with the African deities. He broke the connection with the earth, with the ancestors, with the spiritual memory of an entire people. And maybe you are wondering, but how could this happen inside the church? How could shepherds, priests, bishops, and theologians compact with such perversity? The answer lies in the silent covenant between religion and power. Because where there is political, economic, and social interest, there will always be distorted interpretations of truth. And in the case of theology, this distancing from spiritual essence has become a convenient strategy for legitimizing domination. The message of love was suffocated by greed. The message of liberation was replaced by fear and blind obedience. And so theology became a gear within the machine of systemic racism. It must be remembered that many of the great religious institutions we know today have only become powerful because they were directly linked to colonization. Churches were built with money from slave masters. Cathedrals were erected with the exploration of indigenous and African peoples. And while the banks and the thrones of the churches gained gold and influence, the people were taught not to question. It was taught to be silent, to forgive without justice, to accept violence as part of the cross. And all this was called true faith. But true faith never compact with oppression. True faith does not kneel before the empire, does not silence the screams of the marginalized, does not close his eyes in the face of injustice. True faith releases, denounces, rescues. And that's why we need to revisit this colonized theology and ask, what kind of God is that tolerates slavery? What kind of gospel is this that justifies racism? What kind of spirituality is this that requires a people to erase their history in order to enter heaven? The answer, of course, is that this is not the true God. It is not the true Jesus. It is not the gospel of the kingdom. It is a manipulated caricature, built by interests that have nothing to do with divine love, justice, and reconciliation. And understanding this is the first step in healing the wounds this theology left. Because the wound exists. It is in the communities that still feel excluded from the altars. It is in black faces that still avoid raising their voice inside the churches. It is in the Bibles where the images remain white, even when the characters were from the desert. It is in sermons that never speak of African spirituality as legitimate. It is in the hearts that still carry ashamed of their origin. But this shame was not born with you. It was planted by centuries of theological distortions, of doctrines built to serve the empire and not the people. And now, we are pulling this root. We are putting the light of truth where there was before silence. We are restoring the connection with the God who walks with us, the God who knows the weight of oppression, with the God who is not ashamed to be associated with those who suffer, those who resist, those who fight. And this God, different from what they taught us, does not speak with European accent. He speaks with the voice of the ancestors, with the voice of the people, with the voice of the survived. And you? Have you heard about the Cam curse used as a justification for religious racism? Have you ever had contact with any preaching that tried to spiritualize slavery? Tell me here in the comments. He writes like this: "This theology needs to be healed, or my faith does not combine with racism." Or, if you want, share some personal experience in which you have felt this religious weight that we are now dismantling. Your story can help many people see what is still hiding. And together, we will continue to bring to light what was buried. And it is at this point of the journey that the pieces begin to fit more clearly. After seeing how the image of God was embraced, how art and theology have collaborated to suppress the black divine, we now need to look at where the truth never ceased to pulse, in African and Afro-diasporic traditions. Because even with all oppression, with all symbolic and physical violence, with the attempt to completely erase the original spirituality of the African peoples, the sacred black man resisted. He resisted in the corners, the dances, the rituals, the symbols, the souvenirs whispered between generations. And today, he is here, before us, demanding to be recognized not as an alternative, but as origin, not as folklore, but as spiritualidad and legitimate and powerful. In African cosmologies, the figure of a supreme creator has always been present, and in many cases this creator is portrayed as a black, ancestral, deeply linked to nature, the rhythm of life, to the community, to the cycles of existence. Unlike the European model we have been imposed on us, where God is often distant, authoritarian, and incomprehensible, the African God is close, pulsating, involved in everyday life, accessible through the manifestations of life, elements, body. And the most beautiful of all this is that, despite every attempt to destroy, this view survived. She crossed the Atlantic in the slave ships, hidden in the hearts and memories of the enslaved, and he remained alive in strange lands, disguised as other things, but always present. It is impossible to speak of the presence of Black God without talking about the African diaspora, because it was here in the Americas that one of the most impressive spiritual mergers in history has happened. The African people, torn to the force of their land, reached the so-called New World with their intact spirituality, even if not understood by their oppressors, and despite brutal deletion attempts, where rituals were prohibited, extinct languages, destroyed symbols, Africans and their descendants found ways to continue to worship the divine within the structure of Christianity. That's when syncretism was born, a disguised resistance of devotion. In Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Cuban, Haitian communities, and in so many other territories of the diaspora, the white Christ of the slave lords has never been completely accepted. The people looked at the cross, but I saw the pain of a brother there, not the dominator's icon. Therefore, the image of Jesus was often associated with spiritual figures of the African tradition itself. Christ's suffering was recognized but resignified. He was no longer the symbol of submission, but of resistance, of the redemption that comes from within, not from the outside, of the divinity that recognizes the pain of the Black people and walks with it. And that's how Christianity, even in the claws of the colonial imposition, was transformed. It was recreated. It was reappropriated. Do you notice the strength of it? Even with the distorted Bible, even with European images, even with forced catechesis, the Black people found ways to see the true God. He who frees, who recognizes ancestry, who respects the body and the earth, who speaks through the drum, dance, nature, the God who does not separate from culture but manifests himself by it. This is the God who survived Candomblé, Umbanda, Batuk, Vodou, in Santeria, in the worship of the Orixás, a God who was not created to dominate, but to connect, to heal, to remember where we came from and where we are going. And no, this is not paganism, as many insisted on labeling. This is spiritual ancestry. It is a way of relating to the sacred that preceded colonialism, which has existed for thousands of years, and that should never have been demonized. The demonization of African matrix religions has nothing to do with doctrine. It has to do with fear. Fear of the spiritual autonomy of the Black people. Fear that by reconnecting with his roots, he becomes uncontrollable. And that's why for centuries they tried to erase these traditions. But they couldn't. Because what is born in the spirit does not die in the whip. It just transforms itself. Today, when we see people rediscovering their faith through ancestry, drum, rites, herbs, music, dances, we are seeing a reunion with the Black God who was silenced in the temples, but kept talking about the toreros, a God who welcomes, who embraces, who does not require you to deny your identity to feel accepted. On the contrary, it only reveals itself when you accept who you really are. And this is revolutionary, this is liberating, this is divine. It is important to understand that this fusion between Christianity and African traditions in the Americas was not just a survival resource, it was an act of deep spiritual intelligence. The Black people created a new path, a new theology, a new way of expressing faith without having to abandon what was yours. They said, "We believe, but let's not forget who we are." And that phrase, even if it doesn't say aloud, echoed for generations. And it is echoing now, here in this video, at this time when you may be wondering what have erased from your spirituality. How many times have you felt discomfort to see that your faith seemed to ask you to deny your story? How many times, upon entering a church, Did you realize that there was no one who looked like you in the images, references, music, liturgy? How many times have you told you that your hair, your dance, did not match the holy environment? This discomfort is not sin, it is a sign. It is your spirit calling you back home. And this KSA is the fusion of the divine with its identity. It is the memory that God is not stuck in a European stained glass. He also dances in the yard. He also sings on the wheel. He also speaks through the elders. He also lives on his skin. And when we understand that, everything changes. Because faith makes sense again. The cult is no longer a rehearsed theater and becomes a true encounter. Prayer becomes alive. The music becomes sacred. The presence of God is again felt hard. Because now he has a face. It has voice. It has color. And it's yours. Now I want to hear you. Have you ever had contact with these Afro-diasporic spiritual expressions? Have you ever felt that there was something sacred in the culture that they taught you to reject? Right here in the comments, my ancestry is also divine, or God also speaks to my color. It leaves this registered here, because every word of yours helps cure a part of this spiritual erasure. And perhaps without realizing it, his speech arouses another soul that is also looking for the God who looks like her. And perhaps the most disturbing question, which echoes almost silently in the heart of those who start awakening, is precisely that. Why the simple idea of a black God causes so much discomfort? Why does it shake structures? Why is it immediately rejected by so many? Why is it still considered dangerous, subversive, controversial? What is behind this fear? What is really at stake when it proposes, with courage and awareness, a reconstruction of the divine image that finally reflects the skin, color of millions of people who have been systematically away from the altar? The answer is not just in the religious field. She is in the bowels of power. Because a black God is not just an image, it is a symbolic threat to everything that was built on the basis of racial hierarchy. The figure of a white God consolidated for centuries the idea of superiority of a race over all others. She validated empires, sustained slaves, justified genocide, naturalized inequalities. She has created a world model in which everything that is associated with white is divine, pure, worthy, holy, and everything that is associated with black is marginal, profane, dangerous, dirty. Now think to me, whether this logic is reversed or even questioned, what happens to this whole structure? It starts to crumble. And when the symbolic foundations go, the whole system begins to tremble. Because structural racism is not only in physical violence or economic inequalities. He supports himself in the mind, in the imagination, in the collective unconscious. And it is precisely there that the idea of a black God reaches, in the deepest core of domination. A people who begin to imagine the divine with his face, with his hair, with his skin, with his features, can no longer be convinced that he is inferior. A people who recognize themselves in the image of the Creator no longer accept to be treated as a second-category servant. And that's why this idea scares so much. Because it has the power to heal a wound that has been purposely opened. A wound that was not only social, not only historical, but spiritual. The idea that God is black, or can be black, directly confronts the project of domination that still today acts silently in institutions, in churches, in discourses. And this confrontation is not welcome by those who profit from ignorance, shame, deletion. It is not welcome by those who need a people who pray without recognizing themselves, who serves without questioning, who believes without seeing themselves. But these people are waking up. He is looking at himself and saying, I am an image and likeness of God. And if I am, then I can't keep accepting a faith that excludes me, a spirituality that asks me to deny my color, my hair, my story, my symbols, my ancestry. And when this awakening happens, something powerful changes. Self-esteem. And when self-esteem reconnects with spirituality, freedom becomes inevitable. This is why the fear of a black God is actually the fear of a free people, because faith has the power to shape identity. What you believe about divine shape what you believe about yourself. If you have been taught that the sacred does not look like you, it will affect all areas of your life. The way you see yourself, how you say, how you speak. Now imagine the reverse impact. Imagine a black child growing up watching images of a God with his face early on. Imagine this child being taught that his skin, his hair, his features, his ancestry, all this is divine, is holy, is worthy. This child grows with another posture, with another look, with another faith, a faith that does not imprison, freeze, sow the fear, because this new generation is getting up with open eyes. You are studying, you are wondering, you are reading the Bible with other eyes. You are revisiting your story with another conscience. And more than that, you are finding us within you, not a distant, white, and punitive God, but a close, black, loving, liberating God. A God who does not deny your culture, who does not erase your features, who does not require you to bend before images that do not represent you. A God who calls you by the ancestral name, who recognizes his pain, his struggle, his beauty, his dignity. And this is not just about theology, it's about healing. It is about returning to the black people what was torn out, the right to see as part of the sacred, the right to feel loved by the divine without having to change who it is, the right to look into the mirror and see, in the reflection, not a mistake, not a burden, not a curse, but a masterpiece, because that's what we always went, masterpiece. But we taught us to see us as garbage, as servants, as marginal, as undesirable. And now, when the light of truth begins to hit our face, we realize that the mistake has never been to us. It was in the lie that told us, this awakening has no return, because whoever has seen it can no longer unravel. Anyone who has felt the presence of a God who looks like him no longer can kneel before an idol who oppresses him. And that's why you're here. Because something inside you know there is more, that there is a call, that there is a truth that has been muffled, but is resurfaced hard. And this truth is simple. God is also black. God also has our face. God also walks among us. And that changes everything. If you got here and something inside you moved, write here in the comments. Tell me how it made you feel. He writes like this: I'm no longer afraid of a God who looks like me. Or, now I understand why this God has hidden us. You can use one of these phrases or put in your own words what it meant for you. What matters is that you speak, because every comment, every voice, every word that echoes here helps to break the silence imposed for centuries. And together, we will continue to disappoint what have taught us and reprogramming our spirituality with truth, identity, and courage. And when we finally let this image be completely before us, the image of a black, ancestral, deep, alive God, everything begins to move inside. Because this is not just new information, it is a key that spins and opens doors that were previously locked within our own mind, within our body, within our faith. Believing in a black God is a break with centuries of symbolic control. It is an intimate revolution that reverberates in all areas of life. It is not only spiritual. It is identity. It's emotional. It is social. It is as if, when seeing God with our color, we started to see, for the first time, who we really are. Because when you begin to believe in a God that looks like you, your self-image changes. It changes deeply. You begin to realize that there is nothing wrong with your features, that your skin is not a curse, that your hair is not disorder, that your nose, your mouth, your color, your body, this is all the mirror of the divine. And this recognition changes the weight with which you step in the world. It changes the way you behave, how you say, how you occupy spaces. The shame gives way to pride. Doubt gives way to certainty. The feeling of inadequacy begins to dissolve, because you are no longer trying to fit into a pattern that has never been made for you. You understand that the pattern is you, the mirror is you, the reference is you, and that's where the true impact of this revelation lives. Believing in a black God is not just an aesthetic or philosophical change. It is a spiritual restoration. It is like recovering a stolen piece of the soul, a piece that was torn when they taught us to pray with their eyes closed, so as not to see that God's face was never ours. Now, with our eyes wide open, we begin to break free. And this spiritual liberation inevitably brings social transformations. Because a people who see themselves in the sacred no longer accept to live in the profane of oppression. A people who recognize their image in God begins to question the images of themselves that the system imposed, and that has real, concrete, revolutionary effects. We started educating our children in another way. We begin to consume culture with more awareness, We begin to reject narratives that always put us as villains, as servants, as the other. We begin to position ourselves in faith with more authority, knowing that our voice is also sacred, that our reading of Scripture is also valid, that our bodies are also temples of the Spirit, that our experience with the divine does not need to go through the Eurocentric approval filter. This is power, and it is exactly this power that so many fear, because it is generated from within. It cannot be controlled, it cannot be domesticated. When we believe in a black God, we also reconcile with our ancestry. We began to value the knowledge that was ridiculed, listening to the elders with reverence, to realize that spiritual wisdom is not only in the books translated by empires, but also in the stories our grandparents told, in the songs that our parents sang, in the gestures that crossed generations even without being intellectually understood. All of this gains new meaning. What was seen as superstition suddenly reveals itself as a living spiritual memory, as a divine inheritance that survived erasure, and this reconnection also rescues the community, because believing in a black God calls us back to the community. It reminds us that spirituality has never been a lonely act, that faith is built together in the look, in the hug, in mutual care, in listening. Churches can begin to turn into real healing spaces where blackness is not only tolerated but celebrated, where symbols represent who is there, where the liturgy is crossed by the rhythm of the drum, the moving body, the living word that comes out of the mouth of those who have always been silenced. Believing a black God transforms the church, worship, music, theology, the way to gather. Everything changes, because everything aligns with the truth of who we are. This transformation also makes us more aware of the mechanisms of spiritual oppression that are still in operation. We begin to identify more clearly when a preaching tries to shrink us, when a doctrine tries to tame us, when a biblical reading is used to shut us up. We no longer accept these impositions with the same silence as before. Now we have questions. We have courage. We have the base. We are sure that the God who dwells us also strengthens us to resist. And this kind of faith is non-negotiable. It is a faith that bothers, but cures, that breaks, but reconstructs. And here is one of the most beautiful implications. Believing in a black God makes room for empathy and reconciliation with other peoples who have also been erased. Because this is not an exclusive struggle, but of recognition, of plurality, of dignity. When you understand that God is not a property of a specific people, but manifests itself through diversity, you begin to recognize the divine in other cultures, in other expressions, in other faces. This takes us out of isolation and puts us in a living network of moving spirituality. And this spirituality, when it is true, always calls us for more love, more justice. True. To believe in a black God is also to become intolerant of injustice, because you come to understand that each attack on the black people is also an attack on the image of God. Each structural racism, each exclusion, every silence, every symbolic or direct violence becomes a scream that echoes within you. And it moves you, puts you in action. It makes you a prophet, curator, warrior, bridge, because you know you can't be silent anymore. You can't watch passively anymore. And this urgency, this consciousness, this strength also come from this new way of believing. Now it tells me, sincerely, what would your life be like if, from a young age, they would teach you that God looks like you? How would your trajectory of faith have been if you saw on the altar a reflection of your own story? Would you have believed you more? Would it have prayed with more freedom? Would it have been more loved? Comment here below. He writes like this: "Now I see God with my skin," or "Believe in a black God set me free." You can use these phrases or write with your own heart. The important thing is that you talk, because when we talk, we affirm the existence. We claim the sacred that belongs to us. And this, my brother, my sister, is a form of worship that no one else can silence. And now that this new conscience begins to consolidate within you, perhaps another question begins to echo with even greater strength. Why have I never heard it before? Why is this idea so logical, so spiritual, so true, seems so young, and at the same time so familiar, as if I had always known? But has anyone taught me to forget? And that's exactly what we need to talk about now. The programming process that made us deny, reject, or even fear the image of a black God. The school, the media, religion and culture, These four pillars form the foundation of social thinking. It is the means through which we learn what is right, what is beautiful, what is true, what is acceptable, and also what must be rejected, forgotten, silenced. And each of these systems, in different ways, actively participated in the construction of a mindset that excludes the blackness from the space of the sacred. Since childhood, we are exposed to images, discourses, and symbols that reaffirm all the time that what is divine is white. And when you repeat this idea early, every day, for life, it becomes true in your mind, even if it's a lie. Think to me, how many times in all your years of school have you seen textbooks showing the African presence in the Holy Scriptures? How many times a teacher did the relationship between the peoples of the Bible and the African ethnic groups? How many times have it been taught that Africa is the cradle of civilizations that have developed complex spirituality, deep and connected with the divine? Almost never, right? The school taught us about slavery, suffering, pain, but forgot to teach us about royalty, spirituality, and dignity. And this educational silence is a way of erasing, dehumanizing, of programming. The media, in turn, reinforces this programming with images. In movies, series, and soap operas, divine figures are almost always represented by white people. Jesus, God, the angels, the biblical heroes, all white. When a black actor appears in this type of paper, it is exception and often generates controversy, and you need to understand what this causes. Every time the black people are excluded from the representation of the sacred, the collective unconscious understands that it is also excluded from access to divinity, and this perception sets out so subtly that we don't even notice. We started to think it is normal, which is anyway, that it is wrong to imagine God with another appearance, and the schedule is complete. Now let's talk about religion. This is the most sensitive point, because that's where you should find the truth, but it is often where it has been distorted more strongly. How many churches have you ever entered and saw at the altar the image of Jesus as a black man with African features? How many times have you seen portraits or sculptures of black prophets, black saints, black angels? How many times did the pulpit proud of the African roots of the Christian faith? If you are sincere, you will realize that the answer is almost never. Because the institutionalized religion for centuries participated in the colonization not only of the bodies, but in souls. She taught that the sacred needed to be closed to be respected, and with that, it has programmed us to deny ourselves. And finally, the culture, the place where everything mixes. The culture of consumption, entertainment, behavior, language. How many times have you heard expressions such as black magic being used negatively? How many times the black color has been associated with evil, sin, darkness, while white was exalted as purity, light, truth? These associations are not innocent. They shape the way the world sees the color of the skin and the way you see yourself. And this, when internalized, makes the idea of a black god absurd, offensive, wrong, even though, deep down, all point to this truth. Now I ask you with courage and bluntly, how many times have you seen a black god represented as sacred? How many times has this image been normalized, exalted, venerated? How many times the face of a black god was placed in the center of the temple, the film, the class, the prayer? The answer, once again, shows the depth of programming. It shows how conditioned we were conditioned to associate holiness with whiteness. And more than that, it shows how much we were taught to distrust anything that had to do with our own image. You have been programmed, and it's not your fault. This schedule was thought, designed, performed by generations. But now that you are seeing this, the responsibility is yours. You can continue to repeat the pattern, or you can break with it. You can keep accepting what you have always told you, or you can choose to question, rebuild, reprogram. Because the truth is knocking on your door. It's calling you by name. He is saying that there is something sacred in his blood, in his traits, in his history, and this truth no longer needs to be hidden. When you realize that you have been programmed to reject the possibility of a black god, you also begin to understand that everything that seemed natural, you may have been built. Everything that seemed obvious may have been manipulated. And this paves a new way, the path of conscious spiritual liberation, a path where you are no longer a prisoner of the imposed images and begins to build your faith from your identity, your ancestry, your dignity. It's as if you are cleaning the soul mirror and finally saw your face next to the divine. And the question that doesn't want to silence now is, what are you going to do with this truth? Are you going to keep pretending you didn't see? Will you try to fit in a faith that requires your denial again? Or will you take the bravest step of your life and say, I recognize that I was programmed, but now I'm waking up, because recognizing the error is the beginning of healing, and you can be the healing of a whole generation, just choosing to see, feel, and say. If you got here, I want you to comment right now, but comments with conscience, with truth. He writes like this: now I understand why they hid this image of me, or I was scheduled, but I'm freeing myself. You can use these phrases or write with your own words what this passage of the video made you realize. Your comment can be the awakening of someone else who, like you, has been programmed to deny, but is ready to remember. And when we get here, after all that has been revealed, questioned, and exposed with courage, a simple but deep phrase becomes impossible to ignore. God's image matters. And it matters because it is the lens by which thousands, millions of people have learned to see not only the divine, but also themselves. When we taught us that God had the face of a European, light-skinned, blue eyes, straight hair, and serene expression, they also taught us, even silently, that everything that was distanced from it was less sacred, less worthy, less close to the Creator. And if your face didn't look like Him, then by deduction, you may not be done in your image and likeness either. This subtlety has destroyed more identities than we can imagine. How many black children grew up believing that God looked like the oppressor? How many have been taught to see their own color as an obstacle to salvation? How many black women heard that their features needed to be softened to be accepted as a temple of the Spirit? How many black young people looked at the altar and have never seen themselves represented, neither in theology, nor in leadership, nor in images? This is not just an aesthetic issue. This is spirituality being shaped to exclude. It is faith being manipulated to keep a people on their knees, not in prayer, but in submission. Therefore, when we talk about the importance of the image of God, we are not just asking for a new painting on the wall. We are crying out for a new way of relating to the sacred, a way that recognizes, validated, healing. Because when you see God looking like you, the shame that has been planted begins to wither. Fear begins to decrease. Self-esteem begins to flourish. And his spirituality is finally an effort to fit in and becomes a deep release space, reunion with everything they once told you to forget. And this truth, as simple as it may seem, has the power to free. Free from theology of fear, from religion that condemns everything that is different, from the logic it excludes, from the veiled racism that hides between the lines of preaching, the systems of faith that silence African ancestry as if it had nothing to say. Free from the need to clinch spiritually to be accepted. Free from the habit of hiding your history, your culture, your rhythm, your symbols, your language. Free from silence that was imposed by generations. Free from the lie that made you believe that God could not have his face. And that is why this awakening is so revolutionary, because it does not depend on anyone's permission. It starts in the heart, in recognition that something has always been wrong, not with you, but with what you taught you about you, with what they taught you about God. And this is where a new journey begins. Not to replace one idol with another, but to knock them down all, to allow the truth to finally manifest with all its beauty, its diversity, its depth. You no longer need to accept a faith that erases your identity. You no longer need to tolerate images that exclude you. You have the right, spiritual law, to see yourself as a reflection of the sacred, to imagine, to pray, to sing, to preach, to dance, to live your faith with the face that God gave you. Because this face, this skin, this story, these traits, this root are, yes, image and likeness of God. And there is no system, doctrine, or discourse that can erase this truth. Now that this seed has been planted in you, I want to invite you to reflect on me. What changes in your faith by imagining a black God? What changes in your way of looking at yourself? What changes in how you pray? How do you connect? How do you dream? These questions are not rhetorical. I want you to respond in the comments. In truth, write like this: see God with my face healed my faith, or the image matters, and now I understand why. Or if you want, write with your own words what this journey has awakened you. Because your comment, your voice, your truth may be exactly what someone else needs to start freeing yourself. And if you got here, know, this is just the beginning. There are more. There are much more. The next part of this journey will dive into a revelation that many people are not yet ready to face, but that you, now awake, need to know. The color of Jesus has been hidden for centuries, and historical documents prove it. That's right. There is record, there is proof, there is a buried truth that is being unearthed. If you got here until the last seconds of this video, it's because something inside you has been touched, something awakened. And if this content made you reflect, free you, or connect you in a new way with your faith, then now it's time to give the step. Subscribe to the channel, because here we will continue to bring truths that were hidden, stories that were erased, and revelations that have the power to heal. And leave your like now, because it shows YouTube that this video has value, and so more people can be achieved by this message. Oh, and comments down here. Truth has achieved me. Simple as that. This phrase is a code between us, so I know who was until the end, who's firm on this walk with me. And now, if you want to continue this revelation journey and deepen this truth, click on the video that is appearing here on the screen. In it, I will show you historical documents that prove that the color of Jesus was hidden for centuries. You will not want to lose. We see each other there.